So, thing we want to talk to you about and get your very rational view on, because you're pretty good on this stuff, is you've done your series Gradually Then Suddenly, which, by the way, I didn't actually know until recently was an Ernest Hemingway thing about going broke. And so in my head, I was like, oh, Gradually
You
Then
didn't
Suddenly.
read the first Gradually Then Suddenly then?
Well, sorry, I hadn't consistently associated with it. In my head, Gradually and Suddenly was like just constantly thinking about Bitcoin is like it happens gradually, then suddenly Bitcoin will take over. But then we were like, me and Danny were talking it through, like the Ernest Hemingway thing was like, or is this the gradual and then suddenly death of the dollar? And we're like, or is it both?
Yeah, so I think it's a you'll have to go back and read the
Read it a long time
introduction
ago.
to Gradually Then Suddenly, but I think so. One, the actual text in The Sun Also Rises, I believe, is first slowly, then all at once.
Okay.
And that described the process of going bankrupt. And then that was kind of culturally adapted to Gradually Then Suddenly. So I think most people probably think that Gradually Then Suddenly is what was actually in the book, but it was slightly different, but the same idea. So in the introduction to Gradually Then Suddenly, I talk about how it was how Hemingway described the process of going bankrupt. It's also how countries' currencies hyperinflate, as well as how people come to understand Bitcoin. And that, functionally a country at a country level is bankrupt, or at least they were bankrupt a long time ago, but when their currency hyperinflates, that's when it becomes apparent that at the country level they're insolvent and that nobody wants the counterparty risk of their money. And it is how people happen to understand Bitcoin. I feel like people search for it, or I like to say it's difficult to see, but kind of people focus in on it, and they're hearing things from Bitcoiners, listening to your podcast, reading a show, but it doesn't necessarily click for them. The puzzle pieces don't come together, and then something happens. Either they consume one piece of information, one thing happens in the world where they connect a bunch of ideas together, and it's like a flash in the brain that says, maybe these people aren't all crazy. And not just in a low probability way, but in a way that you could suddenly, even if it was a fleeting moment, could describe to yourself why Bitcoin could be money. And then the trick or the challenge is being able to consistently get back to that same point, that it kind of happens in this flash where, again, consuming a video, a podcast, reading something, or Russia gets cut off from SWIFT, Canadian truckers get frozen from their bank accounts, Silicon Valley Bank fails. Is my money actually in the bank? So it's oftentimes a lived experience. In that moment, the pieces come together, but then you've got a lot more work yet to do to be able to reliably get back to the point of, yes, Bitcoin is money.
Do you remember what yours was?
Yeah, I do. Totally. It's actually hard to describe.
Okay.
But I was up in Wyoming with Will Cole. We had been listening to podcasts, talking about Bitcoin for quite some time. It had started to get there, but we were having some. I was hung up on the idea that Bitcoin was too expensive. That like how's everybody going to be able to get Bitcoin if it, like, at the time it was like $2,000 or something, or like $3,000. I kept trying. It was either, I think it was the end of 2016.
$3,000.
Maybe it was like $1,000. It was somewhere around there. And I was thinking, I was like, but how are a billion people going to get this if there's, and I was, it's just, today it's difficult to go back and be like, oh, that was so illogical. But that was the thing that was tripping me up. And Will made this comment. We were literally coming off, we were like leaving the ski slopes. And he was like, realistically, Bitcoin needs to be worth about $10,000 in order for it to even be relevant. And he might have said be relevant to like large institutional people or banks, something like that. And for some reason, the way he said that, I connected that Bitcoin actually gets more valuable the more, quote, expensive it is, and therefore it's never too expensive. But for whatever reason, like I had been like, kind of coming around to the idea of Bitcoin possibly being viable, but it didn't make sense. And that comment about like Bitcoin, I was like struggling with it being too expensive, and Will made a comment that it needs to be worth at least $10,000 for it to be like relevant globally. And part of that I heard or connected was that as Bitcoin becomes more valuable, you can send more value for a lower nominal unit of the currency, such that as it becomes more valuable, it becoming more valuable is more realistically an output of more people valuing it. And as its value increases, thinking about it as if I could send $1,000 for 0.1 Bitcoin versus 1 Bitcoin, more people can send 0.1 Bitcoin around. Well, it doesn't just happen by magic. It happens because more and more people in the world adopt Bitcoin as value and are willing to transfer and transact their actual real world value for a form of money that can't be printed, albeit that it's digital and it's hard to understand. So yeah, for me, that was the one. It was like it all fit into place. Like that thing I still had some work to do from there, but for whatever reason, that was a particular comment that made the puzzle pieces come together.
Do you remember yours?
So it's the idea that the more expensive it is, the less risky it is.
No, it's that the more expensive quote, the more expensive, the more valuable each unit of the currency is.
Oh, I see.
And like one way that I would equate it is, and I might get my math wrong, but like at $1,000, you would need 10 Bitcoin to send $10,000 across the world over a communication channel. If there were 21 million Bitcoin, that equates to a certain maximum number of people that could send the equivalent of $10,000. But if Bitcoin were worth $10,000, then 10 times the number of people could send that same amount of money. And so it's like, if you think about how it actually happens, is more people value this as a currency, the 1 Bitcoin becomes the equivalent of 0.1, becomes the equivalent of 0.01. And what that actually means is that the network is capable of facilitating more and more trade.
Yeah, I get it. Because you're just using much smaller units.
Yeah, more people are adopting, more people have come to see, this is actually valuable. This form of money is more valuable than my other form of money. And as that happens, on average, people have less and less Bitcoin, but the marginal unit, nominal unit, is worth more and more.
It's kind of the opposite of what you were thinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was hung up with the opposite. Like, not enough people are going to be able to get this because it's too expensive. And I was like, oh no, as more people adopt it, it becomes more expensive, but it becomes a greater utility because more people are adopting the form of money, which equate to more and more trading partners. And that's what money is there to do, to facilitate trade and exchange.
I had a similar one recently, and I'm still not sure if I've actually clocked onto something here. But I was saying to Danny the other morning that say if Bitcoin suddenly goes up to $200,000, and I was to sell 10 of my Bitcoin, I have $2 million, say, and that would be a significant part of my Bitcoin, but I would be highly incentivized to do it, even though I know it could go much higher in price, because at that point, the amount of things I could do in my local town, businesses I could build, or properties I could buy, or investments I could do, I could have a meaningful impact. And, I don't need infinite amounts of money. And I kind of had this moment where I realized that someone would be willing to buy the Bitcoin at that price, and I'm willing to sell it. And whereas within fiat, with this continual inflation, we've been borrowing from the future, I'm kind of flipping it in that I am now selling from the past to enable other people to try and put themselves in the same situation in the future. I can get off the train a little bit. I can take one step down now and do the things I want to do. And in doing so, somebody else is joining the network with that Bitcoin to try and do the same in the future.
Yeah.
And it was kind of that reversal, and it kind of really hit me at that moment.
You're investing in the present rather than taking from the future.
Yeah, and basically someone, like, in theory, like somebody who doesn't have Bitcoin is entering the economy. At the same time, you're taking your Bitcoin to produce something in the present to ultimately make the Bitcoin more valuable too.
Yeah. It's like handing the time preference baton over.
Right. I mean, because like when you think about it, it's like sometimes not spending money is high time preference, right? I think too many people, not too many people. I think I'll describe myself. When learning these concepts, one of the things that was intuitive was that a lower time preference was associated with saving money. And I think that's part of it, but the other part of it is not spending money can also be high time preference. Where it's like, imagine if you had nothing but only save money and you were just sitting there appreciating your stack of Bitcoin, but you didn't have a home that you could call home. Or imagine like, hey, something's broken on your car and you didn't fix it today, and then it broke down in the future and you had to spend 10x. Not spending today would be. And so in your case, it's like, hey, you've saved for a long time and now you can sell a percentage of your money, of your savings, in order to invest in something real, right? Like now, what you probably wouldn't do is take the 10 Bitcoin and just sell them for pounds and let the pound and be like, oh, now I've got 2 million pounds and I'm just going to watch them wither away. It would be to consume something in the present. And that's really what money is there for, to bridge the present to the future, intermediating a series of transactions. And if it is always between money and real goods, and there's some people that have very little money and a ton of debt or a ton of assets, but no good money. And they're going to have to allocate out of that and actually get money. But that every Bitcoiner that's sitting there is doing the exact same thing. It's just like we've been saving for years, tolerating the volatility. As more people come into the economy, we will, on average, have to part with Bitcoin. People will basically bid it out of the current holder's hands. But it's also rational to say like, oh, if I'm converting that into something that I'm going to consume in the present, like we all have positive time preference. That was one of the concepts that I got from the Bitcoin standard. Just like people have high time preference, low time preference, but everyone's positive because our lives are finite. So, and consuming in the present is not a bad thing. It's just make sure that you're also planning for the future. And that's what you would be doing if you converted some of your Bitcoin. You're like, you're consuming in the present for the future. Right.
We're also creating new allocators of capital with a different set of principles.
Yeah.
Like that money's been hard to earn.
That you've paid for. It's not borrowing for the future. It's something tangible, physical that you've saved. You're parting with it in an honest exchange to consume in the present. You're paying for what you're consuming in the present versus borrowing from the future.
Yeah, and you're paying with past time, the time you sat on that, and
didn't consume.
Yeah, and so you come up with a different set of principles for how you allocate that capital. It's an interesting thing. Do you remember any like the things that flipped you?
I don't remember any one thing, but I had like zero knowledge of economics when I came into Bitcoin, and I do remember one kind of light bulb was thinking about fiat as like a changing measurement for investment. And so like if you're constantly changing the ruler that you're measuring things with, how would you ever get something like solid? And that Bitcoin was like a fixed ruler.
It's like Stephen Lubka, isn't it? He talks about
I can't remember the first time I heard it. I've probably explained that badly.
I mean, when I tried to explain what I hung up on, I tried to write about this once and I couldn't get it onto paper well. Because it's like, it's the things that kind of confuse us or hang us up, I think are all like similar but unique. And then the thing that allows us to unlock, like you might have heard something and 10 other people might have been struggling with something similar and heard the same thing and not had it unlocked. So I think that being able to explain something that otherwise in hindsight appears like less clear, doesn't matter what unlocks the mental block to see Bitcoin, but I think that that's fairly standard.
So I had one moment in 2018. So 2017, I was first getting in. I was trading a lot of shit coins. I bought everything, whatever you can think of, Dash and XRP and everything. And I used to keep this spreadsheet of what I bought, the price I bought, the price it is now, the value. I used to track the value in dollars and Bitcoin. But every day I focused on the dollar price. And there was a time when my portfolio was going up in dollars but down in Bitcoin, and I thought I was cool. I thought this was good. I was like, increasing in dollars, and then market crashed. And at my peak, I always remember the numbers. At my peak, or very close to the numbers, in my peak Bitcoin, this is quite a depressing. The total value of my shitcoin portfolio went up to 186 Bitcoin. By the bottom of the bear market, I had 18 Bitcoin. And that to me was a real trigger of like, that
Yeah.
was a real lesson. It's like, shit, the game was to accumulate Bitcoin. The game wasn't to accumulate fiat, which I had thought it was. And that was a gradually then suddenly moment where I eviscerated all this Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And I was like, huh. And so ever since that moment, the game has constantly been to accumulate Bitcoin and kind of ignore the dollar price. Yeah, obviously, when it goes to $70,000, you're thinking of things I can do with that money. But generally speaking, and I haven't, and I don't think I'll ever get back to that Bitcoin number, which is frustrating. But it was a real lesson in the value of Bitcoin. Stop thinking of it in the moment and consider it in the long term. And so that was a real changing moment for me.